Okay, so this is part 2 of Bitcoin and digital currency, the future of money. The takeaways that I want you to get from this particular talk is to start to think about some of the social implications of Bitcoin as a currency. And additionally, what are some of the social or financial implications of the blockchain technology? So because our time is limited, I won't go into too much of a review of last time about blockchain and stuff. That's not going to be too relevant this time anyways. This time we're going to look at the sociological implications. And as I said last time, there's sort of 2 ways of looking at Bitcoin that I was going to cover. And one was the technological, which I covered last time, and this is the social for today. So the first time I ever heard about Bitcoin, I was sitting in the back row of a bioethics class I was TAing for, waiting for class to start, flipping through my phone, and I came across this Gawker article, the underground website where you could buy any drug imaginable. And it turns out that this website, the Silk Road, actually listed all sorts of drugs in Bitcoin. So you pay Bitcoin. Because Bitcoin's anonymous, you could order your early outdoor ex-Congolese sativa cannabis seeds and have them delivered to your door, just like Amazon for drugs. Of course, to get to this place, you had to use the Tor network, which is sort of what people refer to as the dark web or the deep web. I did actually, before this closed down, and I'll get to the closing soon, I did actually go here once, not to buy anything, but just to check it out. And also because, why not be on the DEA's radar? You might as well. So this Gawker article was published on June 1st, 2011. And you can see this is the price chart of Bitcoin for all time. So it starts when they started recording the general trading price around May of 2011 and ends in 2016 around where we are now. And you can see that for a while, the price of Bitcoin was from a few cents to about $10. After the Gawker article, it spiked. It went up to around $30 or so. Or actually, yeah, around here. So it started a general climb. June 10th, so very shortly thereafter, that Gawker article came out, the US senators had read this article and started to freak out, right? Uh-oh, there's an Amazon for drugs. So they wanted the Attorney General to look into this and start shutting it down, which, spoiler alert, eventually actually did happen. Okay, so actually this isn't the all-time chart. This is just the chart for this little tiny bit here. I'm going to show you the all-time chart now, okay? So this is going to zoom out to zoom into where it should be on the all-time chart, right about there. So you can see, so this was the little blip that the Gawker article made, and here we had a major, major spike. And I'm going to use this price chart of all-time Bitcoin prices to kind of act as a timeline for us. What I want to do is give you a little bit of an idea of what it was like following Bitcoin along in those early days and how quickly everything happened. Part of the reason for this is because if we're thinking about social implications of Bitcoin, it's helpful to know what the implications have already been. There are commentaries about human nature you can take from this, commentaries about the economy, about new technologies, about regulatory bodies. So we'll take a look at that, and then as the presentation gets sort of midway or toward the end, we'll start thinking about some of the future implications. But as they say, you don't know where you're going unless you know where you've been. So shortly after the Gawker article, of course, when you have news coverage, it raises all kinds of interest, not just from US senators, but also from hackers as well. Now, Mt. Gox was one of the very first Bitcoin exchanges. We talked about Bitcoin exchanges a bit last time, and it's simply like a marketplace where you can buy and sell your Bitcoins. And when we talk about pricing charts, this is from CoinDesk, and I believe this chart's sort of an amalgamation of all the different prices on the different exchanges. And they tend to be fairly similar, of course, because if one exchange has a really high asking price and another one has a low one, people are going to flock toward the low one, and it would drive the price down on the other one, and it all kind of equals out. But from moment to moment, the price could be a little bit different. So this is sort of an amalgamation of all those prices. Now, I'm going to get into this first Mt. Gox breach here, but we need to know first, what was Mt. Gox beside just a Bitcoin exchange? This was what its original website looked like. It was based in Tokyo, Japan. And the name actually came from Magic the Gathering Online Exchange. The domain name was actually purchased to let these guys trade cards from home instead.
They're not all like that. Oh man. This is terrible.
You could see the reason why one might want to do that.
Yeah, I should go there.
So it was founded in July of 2010, and the web software was written in 1 week. And it was using, I think, a Microsoft Exchange server. So it wasn't exactly the most secure thing in the world, but Bitcoin was a fledgling phenomenon at that point. It had, the guy who had written his original software for the Magic the Gathering online card exchange decided to rewrite some software, use the same domain name, make it just a place where people could trade Bitcoins. At this point in time, I mean, security obviously was a thought, but it wasn't a major requirement for an exchange like that, especially when you throw together some web software within a week, which is, as we all know, kind of impressive to begin with, but it doesn't bode well for things like bugs and security holes. So a hacker allegedly used the credentials from a Mt. Gox auditor's computer to buy 25,000 Bitcoins at an artificially reduced rate from 478 different accounts. From what I could tell, it looks like somebody broke in to an employee's computer and stole a database of usernames and passwords and was able to facilitate that based on that database. The reason we say allegedly is because, of course, Bitcoin's become fairly untraceable. And the Mt. Gox CEO, who I'll introduce you to in a minute, he claimed that this breach happened as explained here, but who knows really? I mean, it could have actually been him who was just basically embezzling, right? So you kind of had to take his word for it. And of course, Mt. Gox is a trading platform, so if anybody's used any sort of investment or trading platform, you can have triggers for different actions, right? So if a price dramatically drops, you can sell right away. You don't have to be watching your computer all the time. It just sets up a trigger action. And so because he reduced the rate of the Bitcoins, the ask price, bought a whole bunch of them, the exchange rate on that platform dropped, triggering a whole bunch of sell orders, creating a cascade of activity. And it dropped the price of Bitcoin dramatically on that major exchange at the time. And the thief got away with $9 million US in Bitcoin. The victims had no recourse. You can't trace it. At this point, you can't go to the authorities. You know what I mean? Like and the Bitcoin price plummeted. Now, both the price of Bitcoin and Mt. Gox recovered from this. I think they were closed for about a week. So that's the Mt. Gox breach. You can see there's a little bit of a dip in the price there of Bitcoin. Now, shortly thereafter, on just October 31st of 2011, somebody else got a fantastic idea. As we talked about before, Bitcoin mining is a computationally expensive process. The more computers, the more processors you have, the better. So what if you could find a way to use unsuspecting users' computers out there in the world to mine your Bitcoins? Fantastic idea. So somebody wrote a virus, a Trojan, that was distributed through BitTorrent files. There was some Mac graphic editing program, it wasn't Photoshop or something like that, that actually, that was one of the ones that they had confirmed contained this Trojan. And it went onto people's computers and used their video card processor, because that's faster than your CPU on your computer, to mine Bitcoins for them. So, brilliant idea. At the same time, it was stealing people's information, doing phone homes and everything like that. So it was actually a remarkably sophisticated virus, and probably made the perpetrator a lot of money. Something that I don't have in this presentation, but Bitcoin has also been used for, is ransomware. So you have a virus or something that goes in and encrypts somebody's hard drive, and you say, if you want your data back, if you want the key to your data, you have to pay a ransom. Well, of course, in many different types of currencies, any sort of ransom payment would be traceable, but Bitcoin's now being used as a way to extort money out of people. So back in 2011, The Atlantic said, "This spate of bad news and volatility leaves many wondering if this is the beginning of the end for the Bitcoin movement. Such a short time." And we have, so that's the end of Bitcoin then, Forbes in June of 2011. The rise and fall of Bitcoin, Wired in November of 2011. So they called that virus Devil Robber, and that happened on October 31st, 2011. You can see at this point the price of Bitcoin's pretty flat again. But of course, the economic crisis was still having ripple effects. The economic crisis of 2008, particularly in Europe, which we're still seeing a lot now. And so we have a couple things that work together as the perfect storm to increase Bitcoin's value. One of them was that after that Gawker article, people started understanding Bitcoin, and of course, once these attacks came out, despite the fact that they were attacks and they seemed like security threats or something like that, it still brought it to the public awareness, and certain people wanted to get on board. So of course, what better way to use Bitcoin than casinos? I mentioned last time there was things like Satoshi Dice, which had mathematically provable fair, it was a fair gambling game, essentially. Fair in the sense of the odds are weighted slightly in terms, in favor of the house. But you could see that, you know what they were, and you could mathematically prove that your particular bet worked or didn't work or won. So you start getting this. This is a Google News, just a snippet of Google News from January 1st, 2013 to January 31st, 2013 for Bitcoin. And so you see BitPay starting to start up, $510,000 in investments to become the PayPal for Bitcoin. You see things about Bitcoin casinos, rakes in more than $500,000 in profit. So it was starting to gain momentum as a very valuable commodity. And then, of course, you had Cyprus. Cyprus was undergoing some economic troubles, partly because of the ripple effects from the 2008 downturn, but also because, among other reasons, they had bought a bunch of Greek bonds, I guess, and when Greece had to have their bailout, those bonds became virtually worthless. And so what happened was the government of Cyprus wanted a $10 billion euro bailout, but it was on the condition that they amalgamate certain of their banks. And as a part of that amalgamation, everybody who had money over $100,000 euros in the Cyprus banks had almost a 50% levy taken out. So any of your savings that you had, 50% just gone to the government. So of course, people started panicking, and Bitcoin was a natural alternative. It's easy to buy, easy to come by. At that point, the price was sort of on the rise again a little bit because of all this casino action and stuff and the popularity that the media had generated. So Cyprus was largely credited for having this little bit of a Bitcoin boom. In July 30th of 2013 is when that started with the bank levies. So under the conditions of the people in Cyprus, investment in Bitcoin seemed almost rational at the time, And then, of course, you get news articles like this from 2013. man forgets about buying $27 of Bitcoin and is now worth $1 million. Right? So this kind of thing, again, drives interest and makes Bitcoin a bit of a household name. Now, I spoke about Silk Road, which was that what the Gawker article exposed, which is what really started Bitcoin's growth. And those US senators who wanted the Attorney General to do something about it. And of course, there was indeed a bust shortly thereafter on October 2nd, 2013. So the FBI seized Silk Road's black market domain. They arrested the owner. They put up on the dark website a little thing about, this has been seized by the FBI, etc. And the owner was a 29-year-old guy called Ross William Albrecht. And he was up on charges for narcotics trafficking conspiracy, computer hacking conspiracy, money laundering conspiracy, and he is serving life in prison without possibility of parole because of that. So they got him. And they didn't get him, I don't think, through tracing Bitcoin transactions or anything like that, because as we all know, that's extremely hard. He became less cautious than he should have been considering his position. Started bragging a little bit, right? Which is often hubris, people's undoing. Right? So the Silk Road bust did drop the Bitcoin price for a moment. However, it further popularized Bitcoin because it was all over the media now. It was really gaining momentum. The other thing too is that those who were early adopters of Bitcoin, marketplaces like the Silk Road was a sort of a blessing and a curse. It was a blessing in the fact that it actually gave the Bitcoin something to do. It actually created a Bitcoin economy, because at this point, other than gambling sites or something, there wasn't a whole lot you could buy with it. And those people who wanted Bitcoin to become a real currency liked this economy, even though it was a black market economy. On the other hand, a lot of people wanted Bitcoin to become legitimate, and it couldn't be seen as legitimate if it was just helping criminals buy drugs, basically, right? So the Silk Road bust, I think, although it dropped Bitcoin's value for a little bit, because of the publicity it brought to it and because of the sort of dreams of legitimacy that started to be realized there, the price started climbing as well. So all of these things, and Cyprus was around here, remember, so all of these things sort of contributed to this perfect storm. And I remember in December of 2013, it was around, obviously it was like December 3rd, so it was, or 2nd, it was around Christmas time. I was in my parents-in-law's house. At that point, I had bought my first Bitcoin, but I donated it somewhere. I bought it for like $40 and I donated it somewhere. I didn't have any left. And then the price hit $1,000. I was like, I mean, who could have predicted that? But at the same time, I was kicking myself. Imagine if you had bought a few $1,000s worth of Bitcoin at $40 a pop, right? So it reached this wonderful height of $1,242 USD on November 29th of 2013. And then on December 2nd, this sheep marketplace, which had arisen, of course, in this space, as soon as something like the Silk Road goes out of business, a lot of others rush in to capitalize on that vacancy. So the sheep marketplace was sort of the next iteration of the Silk Road. But by this point, people are seeing value in Bitcoin, but also value in sort of the underground Bitcoin economy and the nefarious ways that you can make money out of that. So it looked, again, ostensibly like somebody had managed to fake the people's balances in their accounts on the site by hacking into the site, so showing that everybody had their Bitcoins in their wallet while going in and actually transferring the real Bitcoins out. So it was undetected for a little while. And then, of course, those Bitcoins, would go through those Bitcoin mixing services that I spoke about last time, which helps them to become virtually untraceable. So when the administrators realized what had happened, they just shut everything down. And again, the thief got away with something like $100 million USD. Of course, that was bad news for Bitcoin. Another catastrophe. And then shortly thereafter, on December 5th of 2013, the Chinese government decided that it wasn't going to allow banks or payment solution providers to deal in Bitcoin at all. And that news, again, was another hard blow. So between those two things, it sent the Bitcoin price into a little bit of a spiral, but of course still much higher than it was at the outset. China was such a big deal because, of course, there's like 1.3 billion people in China. It's a huge market. And what's interesting about China is that it has very restrictive money export laws. So if you want to send money to family overseas or something like that, it's very restrictive. Whereas Bitcoin, you can do it for super cheap, immediately, instantaneously. And plus, there was a lot of people starting to bet against the yuan. So this chart here, this was in Goldman Sachs investigative report of 2015. And the blue is yuan. I think I'm saying that right? The Chinese currency. The blue is trades in Bitcoin, in yuan, relative to US dollars and euros. So the dark blue is yuan, euros are this. The middle blue and US dollars, which was obviously the majority of the trades originally, really shrunk in comparison. So of course the news came out, and that was kind of bad news for Bitcoin for a little while. So the People's Bank of China said that Bitcoin isn't a currency with real meaning. And so the public was free to take on the responsibility of transacting in Bitcoin if they wanted to, but they wanted to shut down the possibility that any banks would use it or any money payment services would use it. And part of the reason for that is because just shortly before, there was another problem with the Bitcoin exchange, GBL in China, that took, I don't have a figure here, but it closed down abruptly because there was no regulation for these exchanges or anything. People would deposit their Bitcoins and money and real money into exchanges, and then those exchanges could just evaporate, go away, taking all the cash and all the Bitcoins with them. And that's exactly what happened. And because of that, even the price of Bitcoin at that time fell 35% in 40 minutes. Of course, China still has very active Bitcoin trading because exchanges are still allowed to operate, just not banks or anything like that. So this is China's largest Bitcoin exchange, and it does, I think, more business than probably all the others combined. So that's what happened to China. Now, we talked about Mt. Gox already and how they had an initial security breach, which didn't do wonders for Bitcoin's reputation or price. There was another problem that happened shortly thereafter. So after Bitcoin had almost recovered from those tragedies, Mt. Gox, which was based in Japan, which was still one of, at the time, I think it handled something like 80% of the Bitcoin transactions or exchanges that were going on, closed, citing bankruptcy. Because according to the story, somebody again had hacked into the site, which is plausible because it didn't have very good security, hacked into the site and basically stole everybody's Bitcoins. And the guy, the CEO, Mark Karpeles, he obviously didn't have enough to cover this. He owed all these people the money, so he had to claim bankruptcy. It was $480 million in USD and Bitcoins that went missing there. So as you can imagine, as that price of Bitcoin spiked, there was a lot of early adopters who'd made a ton of money. Then there was a lot of criminals who made a ton of money. And so there's all this new Bitcoin money out there floating around. So Mark Karpeles was arrested in 2015 on August 1st by Japanese police on suspicion that he had actually accessed Mt. Gox's records, which is plausible, and modified the outstanding balance to his favor. And then he was released and then later rearrested and charged with embezzlement for apparently pocketing about 321 million yuan. Or that would be yen in Japan. Yen. So is Bitcoin a currency? This is something that is kind of an interesting question, and there's a bunch of different ways to answer it. There are sort of pragmatic ways and philosophical ways. The pragmatic ways are, okay, so if you're running a country and you're the government, you want to know how to treat it for tax purposes and this kind of stuff. So you need to sort that question out. Philosophically, though, it's a little bit more of an interesting question because the definition of money and commodity can fit both Bitcoin. It's a little bit like gold in that way, right? So I'm just going to take a quick look at whether it's a currency or a commodity. I'll give you sort of my take on it. But first, money versus currency. This is kind of an interesting distinction to look at before we get into currency versus commodity. Some people make the distinction on these grounds that money is the socially constructed, intangible store of value. It's a medium of exchange, so you can use it to buy things. It's a unit of accounting, so you can say, you know, $110, this is worth $110, minus $10 equals $100. And it's a store of value. That is, you can actually keep it for a little while and maintain that value. Now, the currency is manufactured or physical representational. So it's like the dollar bill or the loonie, for example, right? So the distinction is between the Canadian dollar, which is the money, and the loonie, which is the currency or the toonie or whatever. The definition of currency requires it to be reasonably scarce, or at least that's a good currency, because if it's not scarce, you can't control the supply. It has to be relatively durable. It's no good if your currency is like mounds of whipped cream or something like that, because it just goes away. It has to be divisible, right? So it does you relatively no good if you've got like a big rock that's your currency and you can't break it up or something like that, right? And you owe somebody, change. It's got to be relatively portable. Again, the big rock kind of disqualified there. Verifiable and fungible. The last one having a couple different meanings in this context. One is that the divided units, smaller units, have the same properties other than the value they represent as larger units. And so essentially the distinction between these two, I don't know if people are familiar with the map territory distinction. A lot of the times this comes up. So the map is the representation of the territory being the real place that the map is of. So currency is kind of like the map. It's the representation of the money. We never really deal directly in the money. We always deal in the currency that represents it. So Bitcoin's kind of interesting. It blurs the lines a little bit because Bitcoin is bits, it's digits on a computer in space, like electrical voltages and stuff. It's not exactly physical. I mean, it is in some way, right? But it's not tangible. It's not something you can hold. So it is currency in the sense that it satisfies a lot of these criteria. It's durable. I mean, so long as computers exist. Divisible, quite divisible. You can go into many, many decimal places. Portable, insofar as it doesn't weigh anything. You can, have access to it on your phone or whatever. Verifiable, probably more verifiable than most currency. You just can't fake it. It can't be, what's the word I'm looking for? When people forged. It can't be forged. And of course, any denomination of Bitcoin has the proportional purchasing power as any higher denomination as well. So we're going to look at the practical real quickly here. What have the different countries said about Bitcoin and its status as either currency or commodity? And in March 2013, Japan said that Bitcoin is not a currency and banks are not allowed to provide it as a product. In March 2013, again, the US Financial Crimes Enforcement Network said that miners and exchangers are money transmitters, and so they had to comply with all the anti-money laundering and anti-terrorist financing laws and that kind of stuff. In August of 2013, Germany said Bitcoin was private money, so it's like a loan from an individual. It's exempt from capital gains tax, but it is a unit of account and can be used for tax and trading purposes. Now, I didn't look too far into Germany's position on this, but I don't know if that means you can actually pay your income tax or your tax in Bitcoin. that would be interesting to find out. But Germany probably has the most permissive interpretation of what Bitcoin is. December 2013, Norway said that virtual currency doesn't qualify as real money, and it treats it as an asset and charges capital gains tax on profits you might make either from mining or from trading. And in March 2014, the IRS in the USA said that Bitcoin will be treated as property for federal income tax purposes. And in September 2015, the US Commodity Futures Trading Commission classified Bitcoin as a commodity. And that's kind of the perspective that Canada has on it. It's a commodity in Canada, and gains or losses are taxable income. So if you mine, for example, and make a bunch of money, once you traded the Bitcoin in for real dollars, then that's taxable income. And it would be interesting to see if somebody, for example, was a miner but lost a whole bunch of money on electricity versus the money that they made on actually the Bitcoins. Could you write that off your income tax? I don't know. It's kind of a neat idea. And for taxation, the rules for barter transactions apply. So this is a pretty sane way to look at it from the Canadian economy perspective, I think. And that's if you pay for a movie ticket with Bitcoin, you owe the tax on the CAD, the Canadian dollar value of the movie ticket, essentially, which is barter transactions in general. Okay, so that's how the different countries of the world are looking at Bitcoin. Personally, I think that Bitcoin is like a commodity in a number of sort of legal ways, but people use it as a currency, or at least that's its intention. And Wittgenstein, a famous German philosopher, had this idea that meaning was use. You know, when he was studying language and semantics, he said that meaning was use. What a word meant was based upon its usage. And sort of analogously, I think that currency is what currency does, kind of thing, right? So I think that to call Bitcoin a currency isn't a stretch, even though a lot of governments are reluctant to classify it as that for obvious reasons, right? I mentioned before that Bitcoin is a deflationary currency. What does that mean? Deflation is opposed to inflation. We're all very familiar with inflation, you know, the apparent like 2 to 3% a year kind of thing, although I hear that that's a bit of a fudged number, especially considering that certain things like oil, the cost of oil goes up dramatically, way more than 2 to 3% in some cases, right? So we're familiar with our dollar buying less and less as time goes on, products becoming more and more expensive. Deflation is the opposite of that. With a deflationary economy, you have your, here, if I can skip forward a couple slides. You have 1 unit of your money, okay, so this is inflation. 1 unit of your money buys, say, 1 loaf of bread today, but half a loaf of bread tomorrow, essentially. In the deflationary economy, you have 1 unit of your money buys a loaf of bread today, but maybe 2 loaves of bread tomorrow. So this sort of seems good from a consumer perspective. When you're standing at the till and you're like, oh, great, my money's worth more today. That's fantastic. But there are sort of larger implications there. The reason Bitcoin is deflationary is because there's a set cap on the number of Bitcoins that can be mined. And certain things like people could lose the keys to their Bitcoin wallet, and then those Bitcoins in that wallet are literally unrecoverable forever. So you actually have losses that happen in the system. Not only is the system capped at a certain amount of money, but when Bitcoins are lost, the actual active Bitcoins in circulation decreases as well. And whenever you have less money, you get this deflationary phenomenon where the money becomes worth more, right? Now, what are the effects of deflation? On sort of a macroeconomic scale, I'm by no means an expert in this, so feel free to, you know, correct me or give your opinions on this, but or facts, as the case may be. So wages drop and unemployment rises. So why would that happen? Well, if goods become less expensive relative to the money, employers go, well, you don't need to be paid as much, right? So that's one way to save money. Unemployment could rise too for similar situations because businesses don't make as much profit in a deflationary economy. So they have to not only pay people less, but let a lot of people go too. Consumers cut spending because in an inflationary economy, it's actually in your best interest to get rid of your money now while it can buy more than just hang on to it under your mattress or whatever, right? And spend it later. So it encourages hoarding and discourages spending. Demand drops and supply increases relative to demand. Of course, when people aren't spending as much, you're not getting the demand for products, so you've got a lot of supply, and that's one of the reasons that it drives cost of goods down. In general, economic activity considered as transactions contracts because people are hoarding, they're not spending. Innovation slows for similar reasons because you don't get that economic activity, and you can drive money out of your country if it's looked at as a nation state sort of example, because if you've got actually, now that I'm thinking about it, it's possible that it could actually drive money into the country too from foreign investment. Let's say your economy was deflationary and you wanted to take some foreign money that was inflationary, invested in, say, Canada if we had a deflationary economy, then you could watch your money sort of increase in value. And as long as you purchased in Canada or even with an exchange rate, you'd come out on top in the long run. So you can see, because of all of these various strands and tendrils, it's really difficult to predict what would happen in a deflationary world. I think one thing that's for certain is that it would shift capitalism significantly. Some people think that would be a great idea. It would shift consumption behavior a lot. People would consume less, people would preserve more. You'd get less of a throwaway society, possibly. Again, it's difficult to know how all of these different factors would react against one another, right? And then how would loans or credit work? Bitcoin's difficult to work out loans and credit to begin with, but in a deflationary economy, if you borrowed money today, that same amount of Bitcoin, for example, tomorrow would cost you more in a way to give back, right? Plus interest. That seems like the cost of borrowing would be way too high. Maybe you could have sort of a negative interest situation, which certain governments of the world are already flirting with right now with their central banks to offset that, but it's difficult to say. What about the environment? If it encourages hoarding, discourages spending, that seems to discourage a throwaway culture, maybe that would be a boon for the environment. Some people think, though, that Bitcoin mining is a real-world environmental disaster, and that's because of the amount of energy required to mine Bitcoins. Of course, if you have a situation like we spoke about last time in Iceland, where you've got geothermal energy or renewable energy or something like that, fueling it, this becomes a non-issue. But you also have sort of market forces that are constraining the amount of energy you're willing to use too, because if the energy that you use mining costs more than what you get out of mining, then there's no point in doing so. So there are actually sort of unintentional systemic reasons you might not want to mine that much, and maybe this wouldn't be an issue, right? Energy consumption. So I want to talk a little bit about decentralization. Last time we spoke about the technological elements of decentralization, in that, if you remember, we had the distributed ledger and stuff, so there was no central authority that kept track of all the Bitcoin transactions. What does decentralization mean to an economy? What happens when governments and banks don't control the money supply? Justice. So it's out of the government's control to a degree. Governments could still conceivably do some things like stimulus spending. Central banks could perhaps influence interest rates. But central banks wouldn't control the flow of money or the manufacture of money. So it takes a large amount of the ability of the government and the central banks to regulate the economy. It takes it out of their hands. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? It's hard to say exactly how that would work out. Also, you'd have the possibility of a global economy. So what happens now when everybody in the world is on the same currency? A good thing or a bad thing? difficult to say. And unfortunately, a lot of the social implications that I kind of want to bring up, I can only hint toward, because there are, especially when it comes to macroeconomics, there are so many variables that can have surprising products or outputs when you modify one of the inputs. It's really difficult to know how all of these things would affect one another, especially because nothing happens in a vacuum, and you always have innovation and people's creativity, whether that's creativity for the good or creativity for finding out ways to exploit the system. So it's difficult to know how all that would work exactly. Are there any questions or comments at this point about Bitcoin as a decentralized currency? Yeah?
Can you just sort of explain mining for it?
Sure, yeah. So mining for Bitcoin, not everybody who uses the currency has to mine it, but it's an option. And mining is using your computer to run a mathematical puzzle, essentially, such that if your computer can find the answer, you get to be the one to consolidate one block on the chain called the blockchain of all the transactions that have ever happened. And a block consists of all the transactions that happen in a 10-minute period. And so if your computer or your mining pool, because sometimes people group together to do this because it's so computationally expensive, if you actually win that contest, essentially, to find this low number, given a bunch of cryptographic parameters, let's say, then you get rewarded in Bitcoin. Now that reward runs out like in 100 years from now or something like that, in which case the miners will only get paid from transaction fees, which are relatively minimal, but if it takes off and there's enough transactions, it should be enough to incentivize them. Yeah. Oh, sorry. Did you follow
So
up?
the impact on the environment, that is the amount of energy
Yeah,
used with
exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
Gotcha.
Now, what people are doing with Bitcoin is they're using ASIC chips, which are application-specific integrated circuits, and they're actually made to just do the one job, which is that one computational hashing function that miners use to try to find that number to win the contest. And they do that extremely quickly, but they burn up a lot of energy in the process. So when you have, I think right now we're at some odd petahashes of every second or something, like the amount of computational power that's running on the Bitcoin network right now is mind-blowing. So you can only imagine the amount of energy that's using up, right?
That makes sense.
Yeah.
I'm just curious, I may have missed, but is the maximum number of Bitcoin, that finite number, is that public?
It is, yeah. I'm trying to remember the exact number right now. I'm not going to say an exact number because I'll probably get it wrong. But it is, yeah, it's well known, well documented, part of the protocol.
You said 2154 approximately
is when it would.
So if you're a miner,
Stop.
this is like a race for you.
Yeah, essentially, well, with mining,
And you would want as many.
Yeah, you'd want to get in on the ground floor and get in early. A lot of the early miners did really well, but now it's becoming more and more expensive just because it's becoming more and more competitive,
Yeah.
right? So, and energy prices are increasing in a lot of places. So that also affects that. Yeah.
So you had mentioned that a lot of the financial institutions are recognizing Bitcoin as a currency.
Right.
But I recall reading something going back to Denmark about how businesses were sort of at like a grassroots level, were communicating with each other within a given community, and they all sort of like, not like a written agreement, but an unspoken agreement where they're going to start offering their products in Bitcoin, and you start to see all of these establishments who are all doing it at the same time, and it could be argued that so long as they keep the trading going on within that commodity, so to speak, that's enough lubricant to keep that whole process going.
Yeah.
So be damned if the banks recognize it or not. There's still the transaction going on, which then begs the question, if it never leaves that context, when does it become taxable?
Right.
It's only when you go to exchange that into some form of actual currency
yeah.
that is recognized that you can get taxation on it.
And that's why I think Canada was smart to call it a commodity and say that the Bitcoin transactions were like barter transactions.
Right.
Because then it can be taxable, even if it doesn't leave the Bitcoin economy. Because you basically have to pay tax on the Canadian dollar value of the good you're buying.
Right.
So unless you could find some way to convince some auditor that it was worth zero, you'd still probably have to pay tax on it. However, you make a good point, right? So as I mentioned before, I kind of consider Bitcoin a currency because people use it as a currency, even though the banks, for obvious reasons, their own self-interested reasons, don't want to acknowledge it as such. Same with world governments. All it would take is a grassroots effort to just say, hey, everybody, we're just switching to a Bitcoin economy now. And that would actually kind of happen. The banks would be basically cut out of the deal, which they don't want.
Right, you had mentioned that it's highly deflationary, right? Because there's a finite number, but you also said that it's highly divisible.
Yeah.
So, it's provided that everyone understood, a coffee is 0.0000, a very, very small amount of what one Bitcoin can represent. You could make that work in scale.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, you could. Yeah. The deflationary nature of Bitcoin doesn't threaten the supply so much, right? As it just makes what is out there more valuable,
right.
Essentially.
Right.
I actually have a question about that because right now, because it's not just Bitcoin, it's any other, so and on the exchange, Bitcoin varies, so it could be $1,000, it could be $500. So the stores who actually offer that you can buy in the store, coffee for the Bitcoin, is it really always the same amount? Because sometimes it's worth 1,000, sometimes it's worth 500.
Yeah.
So is it I don't think it actually doesn't change.
That's one of the reasons that people, in the argument about whether Bitcoin is a commodity or a currency, people are shy about saying it's a currency because, at least at the current moment, the price fluctuates dramatically. There are really no sort of institutionalized parameters that would lock that price down to a reasonable level of flexibility, right? So typically what ends up happening is people will, in their shop, say a coffee is $1. And then when you go to check out in Bitcoin, they quickly check the exchange rate on it, just like if you're buying in a foreign currency or whatever, right?
Yeah,
and then you pay the equivalent of the Canadian dollar or whatever for your coffee. Yeah.
Part of that's a reflection of the fact that we happen to live in a very stable economy. I lived in Zimbabwe for a while when the Zimbabwean dollar was plummeting.
Right.
And you could lose half your wealth in a day.
Right. Yeah, so by comparison, and there are economies like that right now, right? By comparison, Bitcoin doesn't seem that crazy. And part of the reason that the value varies so much is just because it's not institutionalized in any major way. The government doesn't accept it to pay your taxes and all this kind of stuff. So there's nothing really to peg it at a particular price. And right now it's purely perceived value that's driving it. There's not a ton of stuff to spend Bitcoins on. This is still the major impediment to adoption. So a lot of it's speculation. And whenever you get into a speculative market, like we saw in the Bitcoin pricing charts, little pieces of news can drive things into a spiral or into a hike. So the unpredictability of the value of Bitcoins is sort of an argument against it in a way, but it seems like it's a contingent situation, one that could be changed by wider adoption, for example. Yeah. Yeah, sure.
So I'm just for the tax implications, when you actually buy the Bitcoin and then you do exchange and you earn some money. So you mentioned something that is taxable. So do you get the statement from the, right now you do the investments, you get to the listing statement at the end of the year for the tax purposes.
Yeah.
So do you get the same thing for the Bitcoins, or it's actually honest on you to actually report that to the government?
You would have to report it yourself, but I would imagine if it became more standard to use it, that auditors would be pretty savvy about that. And because Bitcoin transactions are public, if they knew the addresses that you were using, they would actually be able to track every single one of your transactions. So if an auditor came into you and said, look, I need you to open up your Bitcoin wallet. I want to look at all the addresses you've sent and received Bitcoins from. At that point, because now they know who you are and you're attached to these addresses, the anonymity goes out the window and they can see literally everything you've ever done with Bitcoin.
They have to introduce legislation to that, though, wouldn't they?
Possibly. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know what the powers of auditors are and if they would extend to something that invasive.
Yeah, that's first, yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
The whole thing is, I don't want you looking at that.
You gotta read that.
That's what I figured I would just tell any auditors that came my way. It's just I don't want you looking at that, and they would be fine with that and walk away. And one of the other things that came up too, I'm trying to think now if I can remember.
7 seagulls.
I'll pass on that because I probably don't remember it very well. So with the couple minutes we have left, basically I mean, you may be sort of forming the opinion at this point that Bitcoin is a really cool technology. It has a lot of potential implications, but there are so many barriers to adoption, including governments, banks, just individual resistance for embracing something like this, the possible security threats, the vague regulation, et cetera, et cetera. There's so many barriers to adoption. Bitcoin itself might not be the future. Maybe some other cryptocurrency will be. Canada itself is actually working on its own version of a digital currency. Of course, it'll be one that the banks and governments can control, but it would be something that could be sort of not necessarily mediated through individual banks, just like the Bank of Canada or something like that. However, the blockchain itself has captured a lot of people's imaginations. Because if you remember when we were speaking about how the blockchain worked, it was something that was completely public, completely verifiable, mathematically secure. So secure using the laws of nature, the fact that it's easier to run mathematical algorithms in one direction than the other direction. And it's a way of keeping track of transactions of all different kinds, not just financial transactions. But it's a distributed ledger that can be used for a lot of things. And so what's interesting is that although the banks are resisting Bitcoin itself, 11 banks, this is from January 22nd, 2016, 11 banks completed an experiment using blockchain technology. Not Bitcoin specifically, but the banks are looking for ways to transfer value between each other cheaply and efficiently. What better place to look than the blockchain? This is a list of banks, some of the banks that were involved, and you can see there's a number of big players, some even close to home. So that's one way that Bitcoin could affect the future, not through Bitcoin itself, but through the technology that it introduced, making bank transactions cheaper and quicker between banks, interbank transactions. There's other things too. This is Ethereum. It was a crowdsourced platform that basically allows you to build your own apps using blockchain technology. And it's like an API, basically, an application programming interface. You can make your own cryptocurrency if you wanted to. You could have real Cerebucks, You could do trustless crowdfunding. So for right now, you've got things like Kickstarter, GoFundMe, Patreon, all these different sort of crowdfunding sites. And we rely on, say, Kickstarter, for example, if a project doesn't reach its funding goal, to return the money to us. Now, that's a centralized source. We have to put a lot of trust in that organization to do so. But if you set something up with a trustless crowdfunding thing based upon blockchain technology, you could have a contingency where if a certain amount of money is in this particular address at this particular time, it goes to this person. If not, it goes back to everybody who contributed. And so again, mathematically secure. You don't have to trust any individual organization. You just trust math, right? You could run a democratic organization from this. You could actually have it so that the sort of gears and wheels that run your organization, if you want to have sort of it democratic or otherwise, really, you could use blockchain technology to do a lot of that stuff in an automated way. And one of the things that came out almost immediately after the blockchain was introduced was this idea about smart contracts. A lot of the times, let's say you're buying a domain name on the internet. You have to have like an escrow service mediate that exchange, because a domain name takes a little while to transfer, but at the same time, you don't want to transfer it before getting the money for it. So it's a bit of a chicken and egg problem, right? So you need an escrow service where the person will put their money for the domain in escrow, and then once the confirmation that they own it is given to the escrow service, then they'll release the funds to the seller, right? But again, that is putting trust in this third party. You could do contracts like that automatically, trustlessly, on the blockchain technology. So that's got a lot of people pretty interested as well. One of the things I think that excites me the most, though, is the possibility of digital democracy. With something like blockchain technology, you could think about, I spoke before about how Bitcoin transactions work and how, you've got a private key that only you have, and that indicates that the particular money is from you, although it's kind of anonymous in another way that nobody knows that your address links up with you in the real world. And so imagine a case where you could actually vote using your computer or your smartphone or whatever in a similar way that you transfer Bitcoin money, but rather than transacting money, you're transacting votes. Would this allow us then to discard representational democracy? Do you no longer need to hire an MP, a prime minister or something? Could you run a country just based upon the aggregate responses of its citizens? That actually becomes plausible now with technology. Representative democracy could be out of the window. We never have to go through another campaign again.
Get those damn die voting machines.
Yeah, exactly.
Right?
And that's the thing, because a lot of people are concerned that, there's ways that people have learned to game democracy now. And there's a lot of financial players, for example, that could lobby the government to do one thing or another. The banks are a big one, right? So what happens if you get rid of Wall Street's power over democracy? What happens then? So that's perhaps maybe the most exciting to me application of this particular technology. Now, I know there's a lot of information, a lot of time, and we're pretty much up. So I just want to invite you now to think about it. And I'm sorry I didn't give you, stories about a possible future, some sort of sci-fi, either, utopian or dystopian future that, you could hope or fear for. Rather, I'd like to invite you to kind of do that imagination exercise. Given everything we've spoken about, given the idea of the possibility of global economies, the possibility of deflationary economies that are designed that way so they're not looked at as a crisis that everybody should avoid, what about blockchain technology for what it means to democracy? What about something like Bitcoin, what it means to underserved areas of the world where they don't have banks on every corner, right? What does it mean for emerging markets, emerging nations? What impact will it have? Is it good? Is it bad? Would we be better off with it, without it? So that's the answer I'm afraid you're going to have to decide on for yourself. And that's it. Do you have any questions?